What if the oldest secrets of humanity were never lost, only buried? What if Africa wasn't the periphery of history, but its hidden core? And what if the stories we were taught to ignore were the very ones that explain who we are and why the world looks the way it does today? This is not a tale of myth alone. It is the story of forbidden knowledge, said to descend from the heavens, carried by watchers, guarded by ancient civilizations, and sealed beneath sand, stone, and silence. A legacy whispered through the Livre de Enoch, echoed in forgotten pyramids, and fractured by deliberate erasure. What unfolds here reshapes everything: faith, power, identity. It reveals Africa not as a void in history, but as a vault, a place where spiritual, astronomical, and technological wisdom once converged, and where its echoes still breathe through the diaspora and the modern world. As you listen, remember, this isn't about belief, it's about memory. If these revelations speak to something ancient inside you, take a moment, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Some truths travel farther when they're shared. Long before names were carved into stone or dates were pressed into clay, Africa breathed as a living archive. The land remembered everything. Winds carried whispers older than rivers, and the soil held echoes of voices that once spoke to the sky. Those who walked there felt it instantly, like standing inside a story that never truly ended. But something went wrong, not suddenly, quietly. Knowledge that once flowed like open water began to vanish, not by accident, but by design. What had been shared in daylight was pushed into shadow, labeled dangerous, forbidden, untouchable. And the silence that followed was louder than any myth. The elders spoke of a time when wisdom wasn't locked in temples or books, but lived in alignment, between stars and stones, breath and rhythm. People didn't worship knowledge, they moved with it. Every symbol had a function, every ritual a purpose. Nothing was random, nothing was wasted. Then came the fracture. Stories were broken apart, meanings inverted, origins reassigned. What once connected heaven and earth was rewritten as superstition. The land remained, but its voice was muted. Still, fragments survived, hidden in patterns, in memory, in bloodlines that refused to forget. And somewhere beneath that silence, a question kept pulsing, waiting to be heard again. If Africa was never empty of knowledge, then who needed the world to believe that it was? Africa didn't just witness the world before the flood, it carried it. Long before waters reshaped the earth, the continent stood as a crossroads of memory, where mountains watched the sky and deserts remembered rain. The land itself felt older than catastrophe, as if it had already survived endings no one else could recall. In those distant ages, time wasn't counted in years, but in cycles. The people spoke of eras, when the sky felt closer, when knowledge moved freely between realms. Flood myths weren't warnings back then, they were memories passed down like scars that never fully healed. Across vast plains and high plateaus, traces of societies emerged that didn't fit modern timelines. Stone alignments too precise, ruins too deliberate, legends too consistent across distant regions. Something advanced had existed, and its disappearance wasn't sudden. It was layered, like sediment after a long storm. These civilizations weren't obsessed with conquest. Their focus turned upward and inward at once. They studied the stars, not to escape the world, but to understand their place within it. The heavens weren't gods, they were maps, and Africa was the center point. Yet when the waters came, or when history says they did, the story fractured. Survivors carried fragments of that world into the future, while the heart of it sank into myth. What remained was a question carved into memory. What kind of knowledge could vanish so completely, yet leave such perfect echoes behind? They came not with thunder, but with silence. The sky, once distant, felt suddenly near, as if it had leaned down to listen. In the old stories, these beings were not born of earth, yet they walked upon it with purpose. They were remembered as watchers, not rulers, not saviors, but witnesses to something humanity was not meant to face alone. Their descent wasn't chaos, it was deliberate. They arrived carrying patterns, how to read the movement of stars, how to mark time beyond seasons, how to shape stone so it mirrored the sky. What they shared didn't feel like magic. It felt precise, unsettlingly precise, as if the universe had handed over its blueprint. Those who received this knowledge felt both elevated and burdened. To know the order behind creation was to see beyond illusion. Rituals shifted, language changed. The night sky stopped being a mystery and became a text, one that could be read, remembered, and taught. But knowledge has weight, and the watchers crossed a line that could not be undone. What was given freely began to spread unevenly, altering balance, awakening power without restraint. Wisdom without readiness became a fracture point. That fracture echoed through generations, quietly rewriting fate. The watchers would fade from sight, but their imprint stayed behind, etched into stone, sky, and story. And with it lingered an unspoken tension. Were they meant to teach, or were they meant to test what humanity would do once the veil was lifted? There was a text that refused to die, even when it was pushed to the edges of history. It didn't sit on thrones or altars. It traveled quietly, copied by hands that understood its danger. Written in an age when heaven and earth still spoke to each other, its words felt heavy, like they carried consequences. Inside those lines, the story deepened. The watchers were no longer distant figures. They had names, roles, transgressions. The text spoke of laws broken not by humans, but by those who were supposed to observe, not interfere. Knowledge wasn't stolen, it was delivered. And that detail changed everything. The problem wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Anyone who read those passages could sense how they unraveled official stories. Creation became layered. Authority became questionable. The divine no longer felt distant and perfect, but conflicted, bound by rules that could be violated. So the text was moved, not destroyed, relocated, preserved in margins, guarded by communities far from imperial centers. In Africa, its echoes survived longer, woven into oral traditions and spiritual frameworks that never fully separated sky from soil. And there, it lingered, like a locked door everyone pretended not to see. Because once you accept that some knowledge was deliberately set aside, a deeper question emerges. What else was removed before the story was finalized? What shocked them most wasn't the spiritual tone of the teachings, but their precision. This knowledge didn't ask for blind belief. It demanded observation, repetition, and discipline. Metals were refined with intent. Stones were cut, following ratios that echoed the movement of the heavens. Nothing was symbolic just to inspire awe. It worked. Fire was no longer just warmth. It became transformation. Copper, iron, and alloys were shaped in ways that suggested formulas long forgotten. The ground itself became a classroom, and every tool carried a memory of instructions passed down with care. It felt less like religion and more like inheritance. Those who learned these techniques didn't see themselves as chosen. They saw themselves as entrusted. Knowledge was treated like a living force, useful but dangerous if mishandled. That's why it moved slowly, through initiation and silence, never through conquest. Structures rose that mirrored the sky, not in devotion, but in calibration. Shadows marked time, angles tracked solstices. The land became a vast instrument tuned to cycles far larger than any single life. To stand within it was to feel small, yet aligned. But systems like this don't survive fear. When later generations encountered these remnants without context, they mistook mastery for myth. And so the question began to surface quietly and persistently. If this wasn't magic, why was the world taught to treat it as impossible? They were remembered as giants, but that was never the full truth. The stories spoke in metaphors because the reality was harder to carry. These beings stood out not only for their stature, but for their presence. They moved with authority, their voices carried weight, and their decisions shaped entire generations. Born at the crossroads between worlds, they embodied contradiction, strength paired with insight, power bound to instruction. They weren't chaos incarnate, nor were they saints. They were intermediaries, living bridges between what descended from the sky and what rose from the earth. Communities organized themselves around these figures, not in worship, but in alignment. They preserved knowledge, enforced boundaries, and guarded teachings that could not be scattered. Lineage mattered, not for dominance, but for continuity. Memory was their true inheritance. Over time, fear crept in. Outsiders saw only size and authority, not responsibility. Stories were simplified. What was once a role became a threat. And so the narrative shifted. Protectors became monsters. Teachers became warnings. Yet even distorted, the echoes remained. Legends across continents carried the same shadowed outline, hinting at a lineage erased but never fully forgotten. And beneath those myths lay a deeper unease, whispering that something essential was lost when memory turned into fear. Beyond the familiar silhouettes etched into postcards and textbooks, other pyramids rose quietly across the continent. They stood in deserts rarely filmed, on plateaus seldom named, their angles softened by wind and time. These structures didn't announce themselves. They waited. Their builders left no grand proclamations, only alignments. Stone faces turned towards specific stars, foundations measured with intent, corridors shaped to catch light at precise moments. At dawn and dusk, shadows moved like clock hands, marking cycles older than empires. Travelers who stumbled upon them described a strange stillness, as if the air itself was listening. The silence wasn't empty. It felt charged, layered with purpose. These weren't tombs obsessed with death, but markers of continuity, anchors between earth and sky. Later civilizations passed nearby without fully understanding what they saw. Some repurposed the sites, others avoided them. Stories grew cautious, sacred places became dangerous places. The pyramids remained, but their language was no longer spoken aloud. Still, they endure, not as relics of mystery, but as unanswered statements carved in stone. And the longer they stand ignored, the louder the unasked question becomes: who taught a forgotten world to build with the stars in mind? The night sky over Africa was never just a backdrop. It was a living script, unfolding slowly, patiently, above those who knew how to read it. Long before telescopes or charts, people listened to the stars the way others listened to drums, by rhythm, by repetition, by trust built over generations. Certain stars weren't admired, they were consulted. Their rising signaled planting, migration, initiation. Their disappearance marked endings that couldn't be rushed. The sky became a calendar, a compass, and a teacher all at once. To look up was to remember where you stood in the larger order. This knowledge moved through chants and gestures, through markings carved into stone and skin. It wasn't written down to be owned, it was performed to be remembered. Each movement mirrored a celestial motion, each sound aligned breath with orbit. Over time, this intimacy with the heavens grew unsettling to outsiders. How could people without machines predict cycles so precisely? The answer felt uncomfortable, so it was dismissed. Observation was renamed myth. Accuracy was reframed as coincidence. But the stars didn't forget who once followed them closely. They still rise the same way, tracing the same paths. And for those willing to look beyond modern maps, the sky still seems to ask the same quiet question it always has. Who was taught to read me first? Knowledge wasn't activated by belief alone. It was awakened through movement, sound, and intention. Rituals unfolded at specific hours when the air felt heavier and the ground seemed to hum. Drums echoed heartbeats, not to entertain, but to synchronize bodies with something larger, something unseen yet present. Symbols weren't decorative. Each line, spiral, and mark carried instruction. Drawn in sand, carved into stone, painted onto skin, they served as keys, unlocking states of awareness that couldn't be reached through thought alone. To outsiders, it looked like ceremony. To initiates, it was calibration. Scents of resin and earth filled the air, grounding the mind while chants guided attention inward. These moments weren't about escape. They were about alignment. Breath slowed. Time stretched. Knowledge wasn't explained. It was felt, absorbed through experience rather than words. Only a few were allowed to carry these practices forward, not out of secrecy, but out of caution. Power without discipline was never the goal. Each ritual came with responsibility, each symbol with consequence, forgetting that balance was considered the true danger. As generations passed and meanings thinned, the rituals lost their context. What remained looked strange, even threatening, and that misunderstanding set the stage for the next fracture, when knowledge would be judged not by its function, but by fear of its influence. At first, the conflict didn't arrive with armies or fire. It arrived with reinterpretation. Stories were retold with different tones, symbols were stripped of context, and practices once seen as disciplined were reframed as dangerous. What had been inherited carefully was now viewed with suspicion. As new powers rose, they carried their own cosmologies, rigid and exclusive. There was no room for systems that blurred the line between sky and soil, spirit and science. The old ways didn't fit neatly, and what doesn't fit is often erased rather than understood. Guardians of knowledge were forced into silence. Some retreated deeper into oral tradition, encoding meaning into song and proverb. Others scattered, carrying fragments with them, hoping memory would survive, even if structures did not. The land watched, unmoving, as voices grew quieter. This wasn't a single moment of loss, but a long unraveling. Each generation forgot a little more, until symbols became ornaments and rituals became performances. The function dissolved, leaving only form behind. Yet even in distortion, traces endured. Beneath the surface of condemnation and fear, something resilient waited. Because knowledge that once shaped worlds doesn't vanish. It hides, preparing for a time when curiosity would return stronger than suppression. Fragments began to surface where no one expected them. In stories carried across deserts, in carvings dismissed as primitive, in chants that survived without explanation. Each fragment alone seemed insignificant, but together they formed patterns that refused to stay buried. Archaeologists would later stumble upon sites that didn't align with accepted timelines. Tools too precise, layouts too intentional, legends too consistent across regions that were never supposed to have spoken to each other. The ground itself contradicted the textbooks. Ancient texts echoed these discoveries in quieter ways. Words translated too narrowly, passages footnoted instead of explored. Mentions of teachers from the sky, cities erased by floods, wisdom shared and then withdrawn. The clues were there, but never assembled. Across the world, similar myths appeared, wearing different names but carrying the same structure. Africa, Mesopotamia, the Americas, separated by oceans, yet connected by memory. Not coincidence, resonance. And as these connections grew harder to ignore, a tension emerged. Because if these fragments belonged to a single forgotten story, then history wasn't incomplete. It was edited. And that realization opened a door many weren't ready to walk through. When foreign powers finally arrived in force, they didn't just claim land. They claimed narrative, maps were redrawn, names were replaced, and entire histories were compressed into footnotes. What couldn't be owned was labeled primitive. What couldn't be controlled was erased. Sacred sites were stripped of meaning or repurposed. Languages were broken apart. Lineages that once carried memory were severed by borders that meant nothing to the land itself. Colonization didn't only occupy space, it occupied time, rewriting the past to justify the present. Knowledge that had survived floods and centuries now faced something colder: dismissal. The idea that Africa could be a source of advanced thought threatened too many hierarchies. So the story was simplified, strength was acknowledged, wisdom was denied. Yet even under pressure, memory adapted. It hid in rhythm, in coded speech, in practices that looked ordinary to outsiders. The knowledge bent, but it didn't break. Survival became its new form, and beneath the imposed silence, something waited. Because once memory learns how to hide, it also learns how to return, often when the world least expects it. What was once dismissed began to reappear through unexpected lenses. Modern instruments started confirming what ancient eyes had already mapped. Star alignments, geological ages, acoustic properties of stone. Suddenly, old sites spoke again, this time in data no one could ignore. Scientists and researchers approached carefully, often without realizing they were retracing ancestral paths. Discoveries felt new, yet strangely familiar. The language had changed, but the principles remained. Cycles, resonance, balance. The past wasn't contradicting the present. It was waiting for it to catch up. Still, resistance lingered. Acknowledging advanced African knowledge meant reordering timelines and credit. It meant admitting that modern progress wasn't a straight line, but a return. For some, that idea felt threatening. Beyond laboratories and classrooms, people felt it intuitively. A pull toward roots, symbols, ancestral memory. Spiritual practices resurfaced, not as nostalgia, but as recognition. Something old felt relevant again. And as this quiet resurgence unfolded, another question stirred beneath it all. If this knowledge is returning now, what does that say about the moment humanity is standing in? There is a quiet fear that follows restoration. Not fear of the past itself, but of what changes once the past is acknowledged. Because restoring Africa as a source of ancient knowledge reshapes power, belief, and identity all at once. It asks uncomfortable questions about who taught whom and why those lessons were buried. Institutions built on selective memory begin to feel fragile. Faiths grounded in exclusivity must face older echoes. Political narratives tied to dominance start to crack. The resistance isn't loud, it's subtle, wrapped in hesitation, in endless calls for more proof. Yet proof keeps surfacing, not to convince but to remind. Symbols once dismissed now appear across disciplines. Geometry returns in architecture. Cycles return in science. Ancestral logic quietly walks back into modern language. For many in the diaspora, this awakening isn't academic. It's personal. Identity deepens. Spiritual memory stirs. What was once felt but unnamed finally finds context, like a rhythm recognized after a long silence. And as this tension grows between remembering and resisting, one thing becomes clear. The fear isn't that the knowledge was wrong, it's that it was right and ahead of its time. The story doesn't end with recovery. It pauses, listening, because beneath the sand and stone, more still sleeps, untranslated symbols, untouched sights, memories waiting for the right moment to surface. Africa holds them patiently, the way it always has. What survived did so by adapting. It learned to move through people rather than monuments, through feeling rather than record. That's why its return doesn't arrive as revelation alone, but as recognition. Something inside the listener quietly says, "This feels familiar." The past and present begin to overlap here. Spiritual questions resurface in modern language. Identity seeks roots deeper than recent centuries. The ancient story doesn't demand belief. It invites remembrance, asking each generation what it chooses to carry forward. This knowledge doesn't offer control. It offers responsibility. To remember is to acknowledge lineage, to honor continuity, to accept that progress without memory is just repetition in disguise. And as the last echoes of this chapter settle, the land seems to whisper again, not an ending, but an opening. Because if so much has already resurfaced, then what else is still waiting beneath the silence? The image was reshaped with intention. Strength was emphasized, labor was highlighted. But intellect, especially ancient intellect, was quietly removed from the frame. Africa was portrayed as muscle without memory, body without mind. It was a convenient illusion, repeated until it felt natural. Stories of builders became stories of carriers. Engineers became workers. Astronomers became wanderers guided by instinct rather than calculation. The narrative narrowed, stripping complexity down to something easier to dominate and explain away. Yet this reduction never fully settled. Too many contradictions surfaced. Too many structures stood where simple societies were supposed to have been. The lie required constant reinforcement, repeated across classrooms, museums, and maps. Meanwhile, those who inherited fragments of the old knowledge felt the imbalance. Something didn't match what they were told. The past felt deeper than the story allowed. Curiosity lingered even when answers were discouraged, and that tension between what was shown and what was sensed began to press outward. Because once a people are reduced to force alone, the return of their memory becomes the most disruptive power of all. Across oceans and generations, the knowledge didn't disappear, it transformed. Carried in rhythm, in movement, in coded prayer and song, it crossed into new lands with those who were forced to leave. Memory adapted, folding itself into survival. In unfamiliar worlds, fragments of the old systems resurfaced as spiritual practice. Drums echoed celestial cycles. Call and response mirrored ancient instruction. Symbols hid in plain sight, passed down without explanation, yet never empty of meaning. What couldn't be spoken openly was embedded in culture. Healing methods, ancestral reverence, altered states through sound and motion, all carried echoes of older alignments between body, earth, and sky. The language shifted, but the structure endured. To outsiders, it looked like folklore. To those within, it felt like inheritance. Even stripped of context, these practices held power, grounding identity in something deeper than circumstance. And as generations continued to adapt, a quiet realization formed beneath the surface. If so much survived fragmentation, what might reawaken once the pieces begin to recognize each other again? In recent years, the past has begun to press back, not as myth, but as memory resurfacing through unexpected doors. Researchers, artists, and seekers started noticing familiar patterns repeating across disciplines, as if the old knowledge had learned how to wait for the right language to return. Ancient geometries reappeared in modern architecture. Frequencies once embedded in ritual sound found parallels in neuroscience. What had been preserved through intuition now gained scientific names, though its essence remained unchanged. The wisdom didn't need validation, it simply aligned again. This resurgence didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, through curiosity rather than belief. People felt drawn to symbols they couldn't explain, stories they had never been taught, places that stirred something older than memory. For many, the pull wasn't academic, it was personal. A sense of unfinished inheritance surfaced, as if something long dormant was stretching awake. The knowledge felt less like discovery and more like reunion, and as this return unfolded, it carried an unspoken implication. If ancient wisdom is rising again now, perhaps humanity has reached another threshold, one where forgetting is no longer sustainable and remembering becomes necessary. There's a moment when remembering stops being optional, when patterns repeat too precisely, when echoes grow too loud to ignore. That moment feels less like revelation and more like pressure, as if history itself is asking to be acknowledged. The knowledge resurfacing now doesn't come as answers, but as questions that refuse to leave. Why do ancient timelines suddenly stretch further back? Why do sacred sites align with data modern tools can finally measure? Why does Africa keep reappearing at the center of these revisions? This return unsettles established structures. It asks modern systems to admit that progress didn't begin where they claimed it did. That innovation isn't owned by one era or one people. That forgetting was never neutral, it was strategic. For those willing to listen, the shift feels inevitable. The old wisdom isn't demanding obedience. It's offering orientation, reminding humanity that survival once depended on balance, not domination, memory, not control. And as this pressure builds, it leads to a quiet but unavoidable crossroads. Because once a forgotten truth starts making sense again, the next question isn't if it will change the world, but how deeply. Beneath the noise of modern life, a deeper rhythm still pulses. It moves slowly, patiently, the way ancient things do. Africa holds that rhythm like a steady breath, unchanged by centuries of forgetting. It does not rush to explain itself. It waits to be approached with humility. Those who sense it often describe the same feeling, a quiet recognition that something essential was misplaced, not destroyed. The land, the stories, the symbols all seem to suggest continuity rather than loss, as if the knowledge chose dormancy instead of extinction. Spiritual memory begins to surface, not through spectacle, but through stillness, in moments of pause, in questions asked without fear, in the simple act of listening. The past doesn't shout, it invites. This invitation carries responsibility. To remember is not to romanticize, but to restore balance. It asks for respect over certainty, curiosity over control. The ancient wisdom offers no shortcuts, only alignment. And as this awareness deepens, it leaves one final thread hanging in the air. If Africa has been remembering all along, what happens when the rest of the world finally learns how to listen again? The revelation closes the way ancient ceremonies always did, not with certainty, but with reverence. Like a fire slowly dimming at dawn, the knowledge shared here does not vanish. It settles. It roots itself in silence, where truth has always been safest. Africa stands once more, as it always has, not demanding recognition, only offering memory. What was hidden was never meant to be hoarded. It was protected until humanity could listen without fear. Beneath deserts, beneath songs, beneath bloodlines and broken timelines, the legacy endured, not as domination but as balance, not as dogma but as orientation between earth, sky, and spirit. The past, it seems, was never behind us. It was beneath us, waiting for humility, waiting for the moment when remembering becomes an act of healing rather than power. And in that remembering, Africa's role is no longer peripheral but ancestral, foundational, unavoidable. Yet this story does not end here. Too many symbols remain untranslated, too many sites untouched, too many echoes still sleeping under the weight of time. The sand has not given up all its names. The stars have not finished pointing. So walk forward with respect. Listen deeper than words. And if this revelation stirred something ancient within you, stay close. Subscribe, activate notifications, and return for the next unveiling. The story continues.